In ancient Greek life, the temple was really the center of daily life. And one of the best preserved examples of this is the Acropolis in Athens. Um, you see quite a few different buildings here, the Parthenon being the largest of these, but there are smaller temples throughout. There was also a treasury, there was a place for food, and there are quite a few different styles of architecture visible throughout. If you visit it today, there is actually not a whole lot left of the Parthenon itself, although you can see the outer layer of it, and there was a smaller inner layer inside. You can see a couple of different styles of architecture. It was a combination of both the Doric and the Ionic styles, and we have been able to piece back together bits of the sculpture that would have adorned the outside to create the frieze that would have gone around the top of the image. Mostly these would have been on pretty much any temple images of the gods. So here we see Poseidon and Athena in their epic battle over the ownership, essentially, of Athens. And we know from study that these temples would have actually been brightly painted, not white marble the way we see them today. And this is true of most Greek, either architecture or sculpture, that the color has just worn away, and what we see today is not how it actually would have looked when it originally existed. There are several periods of both architecture and sculpture throughout the ancient Greek period. In the earliest styles, their sculpture is fairly simplistic and pretty similar to what we saw in the ancient Near East and in ancient Egypt. So you have a fairly idealized form, one leg forward, very rigid, nondescript face, and in Greece in particular, you would see this kind of ribbed hair and these kind of blank staring eyes. And this was the difference between the male figure, which would be shown in the nude, and the female figure, which would have typically been clothed. As the Greek styles developed, these became somewhat more realistic, particularly for the male figure. So you see here more musculature. It looks a little bit more realistic. There's the shape of the body instead of just a straight line. But again, still fairly rigid, upright, idealized face and hair and body, not necessarily looking like anything in particular. Interestingly, the female form does not develop nearly as quickly as the male form. Looking here is still pretty nondescript. But when we get to the height of the Greek period, we get what's here on the left. This is the apoxyomenos, or the scraper. And you have a face that is not necessarily a real face, but an idealized face that looks truly human. You know, there's a soulful look in the face and in the eyes in particular. The hair is believable. But really the biggest change is the stance that the figure is in. So here we have him putting his weight on this leg and really bearing the brunt of it. But then we get this kind of curve on the other side that offsets it. So we call this shape, if you start at the head, work your way through, it makes an S shape all the way down to this foot. And we call that contrapposto. And the contrapposto is really the biggest contribution that the Greeks make to figural sculpture. Now, the particular version of the apoxyomenos you're seeing here is actually a Roman copy that was made well after the Greek original. So you see this piece in the background that holds it up. That would not have originally been there in the Greek version. So it actually would have been entirely balanced all on its own, just on its 2 feet. As we get to the late Greek style, which we can see here on the right with this image by Lysippus of the weary Heracles, which is also called the Farnese Hercules, we see this sort of exaggeration of the human figure. So here, instead of a figure that is totally balanced and upright, we see one that is kind of draped emotionally over this pillar to support it. The figure still looks realistic and idealistic, but he is not quite as balanced. It is focused a little bit more on what the story is behind the image and less on just the balance of the image itself. And this is pretty true of this late style, that emotion and exaggeration become more prominent within the images. So if we move on to Rome, one of the things I really want to highlight about Rome is how smart they were with their infrastructure. The Roman Empire is one of the largest to have ever existed, and it lasts for an incredibly long time. And one of the ways that they accomplish this is by essentially providing the same infrastructure throughout every part of their empire, so that they're easily accessible and the people that live there are not going to have a lot to complain about. So for example, they put a very complex road system all throughout the empire so that they can get their troops in and out, they can bring supplies. If there's a problem going on, someone can be there very quickly. They also created aqueducts. So here we see the Pont du Gard, which is located in Nîmes, France. There were aqueducts all throughout the Roman Empire, and these allowed them to have fresh drinking water, which is one of the basic necessities for life. And if the people have water, they are less likely to find reasons to be upset with the empire. They also create triumphal arches in each of the cities. This is essentially a way of saying, hey, this city belongs to the Roman Empire. Let's celebrate the particular emperor who brought us here. And then they would also have a lot of similar civic structures in the cities. So in Rome, we still have the Roman Colosseum, but there would have been a similar kind of Colosseum in most Roman cities at the time, usually smaller. This is one of the largest ones that ever existed. But the Colosseum was a center for the town. It allowed for entertainment, and it was another way of saying, hey, this is a Roman city. We are here. We support you. We're creating this city for you. If you look at the Colosseum in particular today, it is not nearly in as good shape as it used to be, but if you picture in this image on the right that at one time the floor was covered, this would have been the sort of maze of tunnels and channels underneath it. The whole thing could be filled with water and was at various times for naval battles. It could seat thousands of people. They would come for gladiator fights. They would come for wrestling matches. They would come for lions and other types of animals being baited and fighting. Any number of displays that would essentially create entertainment and keep the people happy. And this was a tactic for the emperors for a very long time to prevent anyone from being frustrated by them being overtaken. The happier they were, the more entertained, the better cared for, the less likely they were to actually attack the empire. The Pantheon located in Rome is actually one of the greatest testaments to Roman architecture. On the front of it, you see what looks like a Greek temple. They've pulled bits and pieces from the Greek style, and there's a lot of this in ancient Roman architecture. But on the inside, you see something that is truly a mark of Roman innovation. The Romans were really incredible inventors. And the ceiling that they put into the Pantheon is this coffered concrete ceiling. And by coffered, I mean these little inset squares that get smaller and smaller that go all the way up to a dome in the top. And the coffers essentially help support the weight of the concrete so that it could go very, very high. And even though it's very heavy, the coffers help offset the weight and bring it back to the ground. And what's not pictured here is that at the very top of the dome is a circular opening known as an oculus. And this was a way for essentially the gods to be brought into this temple. They could actually come down and hear and see the worshipers. So the science of the ceiling is designed to help with the function of the building. And it really is kind of a marvelous feat for this time. And the Romans really are some of the best inventors in the early world. In their sculpture, as I said earlier, a lot of Roman sculpture comes from the Greeks. One of the specifically Roman styles, though, is this aspect called verism, or truthfulness in art. Whereas the Greeks always wanted to emphasize perfection, the Romans were not really that afraid of reality. They felt that man had something to offer. And so they weren't afraid of things like age, imperfection, and they would show these in their images. So, for example, the image on the left here, the patrician carrying the busts of his ancestors. So he is showing, we're seeing here a real figure from Roman life, and his face is weathered, he's balding, we see wrinkles, we see sort of the harshness that life might offer. And then he's holding the busts of two people that he might have been related to. So it lends authority to him. It gives him a lineage that was really valuable to the Romans. And you see something similar on the right in this portrait of an elder. Lines, age, all of these go to experience and were really valued by the Romans in a way that they definitely were not by the Greeks. Finally, we're going to move on to the medieval period. And there are sort of three distinctive styles within the medieval architecture. One is the Byzantine, and this happens in the far, far eastern reaches of what was the Roman Empire and eventually becomes sort of its own region. This is where The Orthodox faith is fairly common, and so we see a different purpose for the cathedral architecture that comes up there. Instead of a cross-shaped church, which is called a cruciform that you see in most of Europe, they have this, what's called a central planned church, meaning that the main room would be in the center, and then there would be little altars around it. And there was no specific one spot that you were supposed to look. So this is the San Vitale Cathedral in Ravenna, one of the best remaining examples of this type of cathedral. And on the outside, if I go back, the outside is pretty simplistic, but the inside of these types of cathedrals would be really elaborate. The Orthodox faith at the time believed in decoration of the inside in every space available. And they would use images of the saints, of Christ, the Virgin was particularly popular, and they would decorate all of these areas to help basically bring the stories of the Bible to life for the people inside the church. So in this image on the left, you can actually see people seated in the very center of San Vitale. Instead of sitting at an altar, they're seated on benches, and they are looking at the images and worshiping. Over a lot of the altar spaces, you would see mosaics like this. Many of the churches would have paintings. They tended to be ones that were not as wealthy when they were constructed. If they were sponsored by an emperor or a king, they probably would have a lot of mosaics, such as this one in San Vitale. And we also get from San Vitale two images that are in your textbook, which are these mosaics of Emperor Justinian with his attendants and his wife, the Empress Theodora, with her attendants. And I wanted to just point this image out because you can see the change in figurative representation that has happened between the Roman Empire and this early medieval period. Instead of realism or idealism, we have kind of the masking of the human figure. You might see one or two figures represented in their entirety, but mostly you're getting a head with a clothed body. And then you also will see off to the sides this, what we sort of fondly refer to as the bunching of heads. Just the same head repeated over and over again to imply that there are a lot of people there. It loses a lot of detail, a lot of individuality, but because the focus here was less on the person and more on their faith, that becomes kind of permissible through the Middle Ages. The Romanesque style is a period of Greek medieval architecture that we really see more in mainland Europe, not in the Far East. It's an early style that is marked by a really heavy construction. So it is shaped like a cross or a cruciform, but the architects here did not really have a great sense of how to manipulate the materials. They had none of that knowledge of construction that the Romans had. So if you look inside, you see these very heavy archways, rounded arches. There would be an altar at the front. There would be smaller altars and seating off to the side, but very little decoration and even very few windows, just because the churches were so heavy that they couldn't really put windows into them. And here's just a drawing of one so you can kind of see a little bit better what was happening inside. As these styles progressed, we change into the Gothic period, and the Gothic style is really elaborate by comparison to the Romanesque. Still a cruciform shape, but instead of just a very basic structure, we actually see them getting much taller and much grander as a result of that. So a couple of things that were done were on the inside, they added what's called ribbing. So you see these ribs running up and down the sides of the churches and across the ceiling. Those help bring the weight away from the ceiling, down the walls and into the floor, so that they actually can build the walls and the ceilings much higher than they could in previous churches. On the outside, they also have something called a buttress, which essentially holds and supports the church from the outside. They also use something specifically called flying buttresses that would go all the way at the peaks of the most tall parts of the cathedral, and again, bring the weight down to the bottom. And what this did was make these lighter, airier structures, allowed for more windows on the inside. And this is when we really start to see a rise in stained glass. Because they can there's less pressure on the walls, they can do more with the windows. And we get these really elaborate types of decoration. So really different from what we're seeing in the Byzantine churches at the time, but again, reflective of a change in importance in decoration and architecture. It's away from the figure, it's more about the stories and the faith. And this really sort of brings us into the changes that are happening in Europe as we're moving from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance.